investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakeland Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 77 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Well, the cost of living crisis has certainly been on a major topic of conversation throughout the country, whether it's front page headlines on any number of our papers or whether it's to do with state or federal budgets. It's certainly something that people are talking about, and it doesn't really matter whether it's the groceries, power bills, petrol, rent, mortgages, everything seems to be going up. And so given that most people are looking for affordable alternatives. It got me thinking, me being a former country boy, and certainly like to still refer to myself as one, could the significant regional push that we saw during the pandemic be reignited as a result of the affordability crisis that we're going through? So I thought for today's podcast, we could have a look at what draws people to regional living, and could there actually be another pandemic push that could return as a result of this cost of living crisis? And as a result of that, should we be considering buying investment properties in regional areas, perhaps over Melbourne? Now, this will be a Victorian focus, as we always are. We focus on Melbourne, it's what we know. But it certainly could be relatable around other parts of the country as well. So first off, let's have a look at why the regional push and why the demand occurred and what people look for in terms of moving to regional areas. I think the first one is mainly to do with the lifestyle. It's obviously less rush, far less traffic, which I think is a real draw card. Anyone who lives around Melbourne and has to get in a car during peak hour times would certainly agree with that. There's certainly more mobility. It's a lot easier to get around, whether it's relying on being able to use your legs or whether it's bike riding, that sort of thing. It's quite easy to get around regional lifestyles. I think one of the other things is the outdoor lifestyle that you can get. Now, people might joke at that being in Victoria and the weather is not necessarily as good as some of our northern counterparts in this country, but the outdoor lifestyle, whether it's camping, fishing, sport, those sorts of things, mountain biking, hiking in a lot of the wonderful mountain regions we've got around the state. The outdoor lifestyle that regional Victoria particularly offers is fantastic, and that's certainly been a draw card to get out of the hustle and bustle of the city. People feel as though that there's a bit more of a community feel. They know each other, and that can be quite attractive as well. It's quite often a lot quieter. You don't get the hustle and bustle at all hours of the night of traffic and congestion. And safety is also a big thing as well. Now, people might you unfortunately have to look at some of the really sad and disappointing circumstances of things that have been occurring in Ballarat in recent times, but typically regional living is probably considered to be a bit safer than what being in the metropolitan areas are. So these are all draw cards that might take people to a regional lifestyle. The next element is around the affordability, and I guess that's where we come into property and where it becomes relatable to what we talk about on this podcast. And we do find that housing is cheaper, and considerably so in many areas, not necessarily across the board in regional areas, but it is certainly more affordable. And I've had a look at median dwelling prices across the major regional cities in Victoria, so Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, and looked at comparing those from a value perspective, but also versus a rental perspective as well. And if we look at those at the moment, Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, Ballarat sitting at the median dwelling price. And so I emphasise here that this is dwelling rather than house or apartment or unit. It's dwelling, so it encompasses all of those options. And these statistics are from CoreLogic. Ballarat's median value at the moment is $541,000. Bendigo is $546,000. Geelong jumps up to $728,000. And Melbourne is at $780,000. Now, it's probably skewed a little bit there, these statistics, because Melbourne obviously has a lot more apartments than what the regional areas do, and that certainly pulls the data backwards a little bit. But it's certainly, the gap there is certainly a lot less. And if we look at the 5-year percentage change, that takes us back to 2019. We see that Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong have been increasing over that period of time between 30 and 40%, whereas Melbourne is only 23%. So there's been a lot more growth during the past 5 years, primarily to do with the pandemic and the demographic shift that we did see towards regional living. And that's certainly driven a lot of the growth that the regional areas have seen over that period of time. The rental market's not too different. So from Ballarat, it's $425 a week. Bendigo, $466 a week. Geelong, $524 a week. And Melbourne's up at $589 per week. Now, again, the shifts probably haven't been as big in the rental market over that period of time. They've sort of varied in the regional areas between 20 and 30%. And Melbourne sort of sits around the 24%. So in terms of shifts, they've been quite similar. But a lot of that in Melbourne has been made up in the last probably 12 to 18 months. In the last year, the annual change in rents has been almost 10% in Melbourne alone. So the strong demand from a rental perspective is certainly evident in that area. So these are big factors for people to consider, because these are the regional cities. That's not necessarily looking at more affordable options in smaller towns that perhaps are a little bit further away from Melbourne. There's even more affordable options from a median price perspective in those areas. But the gap is certainly significant. I mean, Ballarat at 540 versus Melbourne at 780,000. There's a considerable saving there for people from a mortgage perspective, but also from a rental point of view. So it could be an option that people consider, providing employment opportunities and their lifestyle enables them to be able to make that move. But it's certainly a consideration if pressures are getting to people living in metropolitan areas, that may be something that they could consider. And another factor on the affordability side of things is education. Now, there's good quality government education all across the country, but if you are looking at it from a private education, so private school perspective, and again, we'll look at, say, specific areas here, but Ballarat has got some really well-regarded schools. Ballarat and Clarendon Colleges achieve some of the highest VCE results every year. And from an affordability perspective, private school education is very expensive, but if it's something that you are wanting to factor in, but it is could be cost prohibitive in Melbourne, where prices are typically hovering around the $30,000-$35,000 per annum, you can, looking at Ballarat and Clarendon's figures, that they're more around the $15,000 to $20,000 over that period of time. So that's a significant difference to get an education that many would consider to be just as good as anything in metropolitan areas. So that's another factor that people could consider and could be looking at when considering making the move to a regional area. The next, as I said briefly before, is employment opportunities. Now, as technology's developed and business has certainly moved with the times, it's meant that people have been able to move to regional areas, and many businesses have actually moved because of the cost basis of running their business is cheaper in a regional area, and particularly if their employees are more than happy to make that move as well. So they've been able to get out of the city and look at more affordable options. And that helps to run a business, particularly if you don't necessarily need to be in a metropolitan area. You could reduce your costs, but keep your profits or increase your profits, because you can do just as well in those areas. The other benefit with what we've seen through the pandemic period is that the work from home opportunities that many businesses now offer to employees means that people don't necessarily need to be in the office every day. And so that might be a case of being in the office 1 or 2 days a week and being able to work from home 3 or 4 days a week, depending upon the balance there. And that can very much favour those wanting to move to regional areas. And if you're in some of these regional cities, the Ballarat, Bendigos, Geelongs, or moving out to Traralgon, Warragul, those sorts of areas, it's very easy to get to the city from those locations with the transport linkages and infrastructure that Victoria does have in place. So those employment opportunities have meant that it is a far more relevant consideration for people to make when looking at affordable options in some of the regional areas. So where are people moving to? Well, typically we see that it is potentially one of these regional cities, or it may well be more of a tree change or a sea change. So if we look at each of those options, the sea change typically means people are looking on most instances either of the peninsulas, the Bellarine or Mornington, or even perhaps a little bit further down the coast along the surf coast as well. Gippsland's becoming quite popular, although for some people that might be considered a little bit isolated, but for others that's the benefit, is that it is that little bit further away. It doesn't have any metropolitan influence and it does have a real community regional feel. So the sea change, those are we're obviously bounded by the coastal regions. That's the gist of doing it. But there's certainly some good options in those areas. The tree changes, well, again, for that you probably really are looking to get further away. That's the idea, again, of a tree change, is to really move away from that metropolitan living. So some of the areas up around Dalesford, Hepburn, Castlemaine, Woodend and Macedon Ranges are very popular. And also heading up through the Yarra Valley and then further up into the Alpine regions as well is quite popular as well. Or you can go up to my old hood, which is up in the Wimmera and the Mallee type locations. So there's certainly plenty of opportunities around and different areas that people are considering. Obviously, the regional cities are probably a bit of a compromise for some people, in that you get in a lot of the regional cities, the Ballarat, Bendigos, Geelongs, they are popular because they offer many of the same services that metropolitan living does, but potentially at more affordable prices. So for many people in those regional cities, they could actually get to the airport quicker than many Melbourne residents could, because of the transport linkages and things that are in place there. So, and everything else that metropolitan living offers, these cities do as well. So there's definitely benefits, and the draw card of metropolitan living has been lessened by the fact that many of these cities offer those sorts of lifestyles already. So when do people typically look to make these changes? Well, we've found that there's probably 3 different stages of life where it's quite common. First one being when you graduate, whether it's from secondary school or from post-secondary education. People are looking for employment opportunities, and sometimes the regional areas can find it a little difficult to recruit. So if you are looking there, then there could be some really good employment opportunities in those areas. Another time where it's quite common is around young family. People have got a probably more established career at that point in time and are looking to settle down. And typically they're looking to find somewhere to raise children. So they'll be looking at what education options they've got, where they're going to send their kids to school, and they'll probably want a long-term home. So that's typically when they'll start to, okay, well, let's make the move now so that we can get settled before school starts, those sorts of things too. And the other time that's quite common is around retirement. People are looking for a place to enjoy their retirement so they can enjoy things they like doing, golf, fishing, community events, that sort of thing. But they quite often at that stage of life, many retirees are wanting to make sure that they still have good medical services. So within close proximity to some form of major regional city, if you are making the move out of metropolitan areas, we tend to see that that's quite important to retirees as well. So those are the sorts of things that people are considering when looking at why they might actually look to move to a regional city. And I guess the question then is, well, is that going to be enough to drive growth and see another pandemic type wave of demographic shift? And therefore, is it going to be something that you should look at in terms of an investment strategy? So because of these pushes, will that mean that we'll see more people from an affordability side of things look to move to regional areas? From my perspective, I think there's a few other considerations when you're looking at buying an investment property that you should factor in. First one being that the level of immigration that we're seeing to Australia at the moment is quite strong, which is great. We're seeing a lot of increases in population, that sort of thing. But you do typically find that most immigrants remain in metropolitan areas. They've probably got existing communities there with people of like-minded natures from the countries that they've come. And so it makes the transition from their homeland to Australia a bit easier. And it's probably a bit more similar in terms of being in a city as opposed to being in a regional area. So you tend to find that they do reside in metropolitan areas more. So the population growth is stronger in those areas as well, which is obviously therefore leading to increases in demand. And if we're looking at it from a financial perspective on an investment property side of things, we want to see upward pressure on values, upward pressure on rents, so that we can continue to make a profit over those sorts of things. And that will obviously lead to property prices going up too. Now, I think another important factor here is looking at Melbourne and where it sits in terms of whether you should be buying an investment property in Melbourne or whether you should be looking at some of these regional areas. And I think, as I said earlier when I was talking about the statistics from CoreLogic, it's really important to understand that some of the growth that's been seen in the past 5 years in these regional cities is beyond what they would usually experience. And therefore, is it going to be sustainable long term? Versus what Melbourne's seen is probably below what we would expect, and where it currently sits on the grand scale of things around other capital cities is that Melbourne looks to be quite affordable at the moment and probably quite good value. I mean, Sydney, the median value for dwellings up there at the moment is well in excess of $1 million. I think it's up over 1.1. Brisbane's well up into the 800s, so exceeding Melbourne. And Adelaide's catching Melbourne very quickly. So in the grand scheme of things, when you look back on statistics and look where Melbourne values sit relative to other cities around the country, it is actually looking quite attractive at the moment. So if you're comparing buying an investment property in a regional area versus Melbourne, and if you have the capacity, I would be tending to focus more on Melbourne at the moment because I think the value is definitely there to be had. And I think in order to see those consistent growth patterns in regional areas, we'd probably need to see another significant demographic shift like we saw during the pandemic to continue to see those growth levels the way they've been. I'm just not sure it's sustainable to keep seeing them at the levels that they've been at. Now, that's not to say that there's not certainly still growth options there, and I personally think that the regional push and the growth patterns will be better than what it was pre-pandemic because of a lot of the structural changes and the lifestyle changes that have now come about because of COVID, and the fact that a lot of people are able to work from home, and so there is more living regionally is certainly more attractive and more feasible for a lot of people. So it will see options and better demand for properties in those areas, and I think better performance. I'm just not convinced it's going to be better than metropolitan Melbourne with the right types of properties. So hopefully you found that useful and insightful around the metropolitan versus regional living. As always, thanks for joining me. Today was episode 77, so we're certainly getting up there. But as always, please feel free to share the podcast with friends, family, colleagues, and anyone else who has an interest in property. And if you'd like further information on how to make rewarding property decisions, visit our website, wakeland.com.au. We wish you all the best with your property decisions.